You're listening to episode 114 of Bionic Planet, entitled Michael Greene, Carbon Cowboy or Lone Ranger. My guest is Michael Greene, who was the subject of a story that ran in July in the Washington Post, titled How Carbon Cowboys Are Cashing In on Protected Amazon Forest. It portrayed him as a land grabber of epic proportions. So, why am I featuring him on Bionic Planet? Mostly because his story is a little story that helps tell a much larger story about the challenges of ending deforestation, but also because I believe, based on the evidence to date, that he's been unjustly pilloried, although not all the evidence is in and Michael does have his quirks. I think there's an unfolding saga here that we should keep our eyes on in the lead up to next year's climate talks in Belém. I've been speaking to Michael Greene intermittently since 2015, and I alluded to him in episode 98 of Bionic Planet called The Case of the Tangled Titles, Unraveling the Legal Complexities of Land Ownership in the Amazon. That episode ran 3 months before the Washington Post ran its story, and my guests were Olivier Lejeune and Vinny Maffei of Quantum Commodity Intelligence. Together, we explored a decades-old and quite high-profile, well-known problem in the Amazon, namely confusion over who actually owns the land. This issue predates carbon finance, but as we discussed, carbon markets might be driving efforts to untangle these titles, although that's not how it was presented in the Washington Post. Michael stepped into this legal quagmire back in 2009, and his journey is enlightening. Now, I mentioned his quirks. He can be difficult to follow at times, in part because he has Asperger's syndrome, which we'll explore in a later episode. I think that's one reason he gets into trouble. He can be pretty blunt, and he often seems to lack filters, which ends up rubbing some people the wrong way. We had 2 in-depth conversations a few weeks back, totaling nearly 7 hours. I've been working to distill them into one concise episode, but sometimes an epic story demands room to breathe. So I left a lot of digression in, and am instead dropping 2 episodes of about 2 hours each, and I might even have to stretch it out to 3. Now, while I haven't verified everything Michael says, I can confidently tell you this. In those areas that I have been able to verify, his account holds up far better than the Washington Post story, which relies heavily on a single local official and a questionable report from a dubious NGO. It pains me to say that because I subscribe to the Post and I generally see it as a top-notch newspaper. But they blew it here, as I pointed out in episode 108 called The Washington Post's Head-Scratcher of a Carbon Story. I see this episode and its companion episode, which I'll run in a couple of weeks, as raw material for several print pieces. But my objective isn't to adjudicate who is right and who is wrong in this. I'm trying to offer a glimpse into how difficult it is to get conservation projects off the ground, the challenges they face and how they overcome them, and to provide a bit of the yin to the Washington Post yang. It's an unvarnished and unstructured look at the challenges of ending deforestation. Let's dive in.
Man may be unwittingly changing the world's climate through the waste products of his civilization.
There's a group of us now who are proposing that the Earth has actually entered a new epoch, and that is the Anthropocene.
We know that the enemy is carbon, and we know its ugly face. We should put a big fat price on it, and of course, add to that, drop the subsidies.
Michael, let's start talking about this project you developed in Portel. And I think a good place to start is by looking at the threats that were in place. What was the situation when the project began? Who were the landowners? What were the threats to the deforestation? And how were they being identified?
The project was basically owned by a person named Jonas Morioka and then another group from Japan called Mokichi Okada. And they had stopped logging it, from what I understand, in around 2008. And the threats to the area primarily in this period of time before the project started was illegal logging. And they were basically staking claims as, this is my territory, I have no documentation, but this is mine. And
the illegal loggers were.
The illegal loggers. And the way they work together is...
And just to clarify, the landowners had been logging. It was a Japanese physician named Jonas Morioka and a Japanese company.
Mokichi Okada, yes.
Mokichi Okada, okay. And they were logging legally into 2008, and then there were illegal loggers coming in.
It's actually a story like this. Morioka was logging, and from the way I pieced it together, and I never had real good clarity on it, but I've seen a lot of contracts in his file cabinets where the people who were logging it illegally used to be contracted parties who were legally logging it with Morioka. Mm-hmm. And so when Morioka stopped, they basically continued. And each one of them had a zone on the property because it was a massive area, over 500,000 hectares, which is over 1.2 million acres. And so these legal loggers became illegal loggers because they didn't actually agree with Morioka to stop. And they had these zones, and that was the issue. That was the threat to the area. But then what happened as this hair comb deforestation that takes place in the Amazon, it was starting to reach the borders of the property. So around 2018-19, the threat changed. It no longer was only illegal loggers. It started to being settlers and land grabbers. And unfortunately, some of these land grabbers are basically... It will be one very wealthy individual using straw men to claim massive areas. And so in 2018, the program at the time was called Terra Legal, which is a Portuguese pronunciation for terra legal. And that was a program that allowed in that region claims of about 1,000 hectares. So you would have from 1 week to the next 32,000 hectares being claimed by random people, but it all happened to be the same survey engineer. And when we saw the same survey engineer doing these claims, we realized that the threat was really more of an organized crime threat where there organized land grabbing taking place.
Okay, let me summarize this a bit because it's a 3-act play and we're in Act 1, setting the stage here. And you've described something that is pretty common. I've seen it happen in Indonesia and elsewhere. You have what seems to be a lot of small people taking action, and there's one wealthy person or two wealthy people behind it. And in this case, you're saying there was one technician. I think you said technician.
The technician, right? The survey engineer, is the person who's doing the paperwork
Mm-hmm.
for these small individuals, these supposed small individuals doing the land grab.
Mm-hmm.
And so he basically is doing all the paperwork for these 32 individuals. And this is something that we saw in 2012. And then another survey engineer, I think it was the same guy, he did another 20 of them in 2014. So altogether, I think it was like 56,000 hectares total that this one individual was helping his boss land grab. And
okay,
so go ahead.
They work for the people who are filing the claims. They don't. It's not like some government official who just everything happened to file through. Is it possible that one guy just happened to be really popular and in demand? Or is that not the way it works?
When they originally did this land grab in 2012, I thought at the time like he might have been like selling a service. Hey, I'm going to help you get 1,000 hectares. Go pay me, and then I'm going to help you do it. But then today there's one property over that whole area. So it took 10 years to play out, and how it played out was it's just one guy.
What do you mean one property over the whole area?
Because what they do is after they've succeeded in getting the title, they group those titles into one title.
Gotcha, okay.
So It becomes one property. So we actually, at the time in 2012, we called up one of the people. We found the phone number on the internet, and we asked, hey, are you getting this land in this part of the Amazon? And it was an auto parts dealership in Belen. And the lady who owned the business said, whose name was on the land grab, I said, are you doing this? And she goes, I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't own any land. I don't want any land. I have nothing to do with that. I think they're just buying people's data and using that to do the land grab.
Okay. I think we should explain this because the term land grab, you think of people walking in and physically occupying land, and that does happen, but you're talking about electronic land grabbing.
Yes.
Maybe can you explain to us what the car is? Because that becomes important later.
The car officially came out in 2008. It's a part of the
it was
rural.
later than that. Okay.
Officially, it became mandatory and obligatory in 2012 as part of the new forest code law. But the original car was 2008, It was funded by the Norwegian government as the money went to the Amazon Fund. And in total, I actually went through the spending for the Amazon Fund, and in total they spent around 468 million reais on this environmental registry. And a lot of that funding wasn't actually for the computer program. It was mostly like get out the word and marketing, pushing it out to the population. By the way, you have to do this. And it was incredibly successful in identifying properties and identifying what was open, referring to what was not forest, and what was forest. And it was a declaratory document, so you declare what is your forest and what is your non-forest. And how it worked is, it worked really well to basically state, this is what I have as forest. And so if that forest started changing over time, then the government can say, hey, hold on. When you did this 2 years ago, you had 100 hectares of forest. Now you only have 50 hectares of forest. You illegally deforested, or somebody illegally deforested, and you're now responsible for that. And that's basically how it worked. That's how it worked. It was great. And the map was precise. It was a very detailed map of everybody's property. And we can get into what changed. That's all.
Yeah, I think we should do that, but later. It's interesting that something became less efficient rather than more efficient over time. But another thing we should talk about is the Forest Code, which I think came into effect under Lula, if I remember correctly, or at least it was amended then. And it said that if you owned area in the Amazon, you could develop 20% of it, but 80% of it had to stay forest. That was the fundamental law. And then there are layers on top of that.
I believe that goes way back before Lula. I think that goes back to, 96 or 98.
Mm-hmm.
The law is 80-20. So you're allowed to develop 20% and you have to keep forest 80. Now, here's what happens. Once a region has basically cut down 30%, it is still considered Amazon biome, but it's no longer considered like a forested biome. And I'm not sure if this is unofficial or official, but what happens is the landowners of that region will try to push the law to change for that specific region to 50-50.
Mm-hmm.
And that means they've cut down 30%. Let's now push it to 50. Now we can cut down another 20%. And so they actually change. And that's what I believe has happened around the Paragominas region, or they were lobbying for that. So it's a moving law.
Yeah, we don't want to, because Paragominas is another municipality.
Yeah, Paragominas is another municipality outside of Portel where they basically cut down 50% of everything. And now they had to readjust the law to, otherwise everybody would be in trouble.
And one thing you mentioned that we should flesh out is this hair comb pattern. Can you describe it, or should I?
Yeah, let's say there's a highway and they make these perpendicular roads to the highway every kilometer. And the roads go up. They might go 50 or 60 kilometers into the forest. And people just settle it. And, and a lot of this is governmental programs back from like the 90s and 80s where each person is allowed to claim 200 hectares. And these are remnants. You don't see it new ones as much today because basically all the major highways in the Amazon already had this effect. But what you do is just see an expansion of deforestation where this is taking place.
You start to see the needles on the comb getting thicker.
Yes, basically.
Yeah.
Or clogged with more hair. Maybe the hair represents the deforestation.
Okay, and you also mentioned settlers. Now, they play a key role in this. There were settlers coming in even before illegal deforestation, and you're primarily trying to work with settlers, right?
Yeah, it's people in the Amazon. If life is tough, if you're in a big city and you can't get a job, or you can't hold down a job, or you just weren't fortunate enough to have a good quality education, your best option in many cases is just to go into the forest, build a house out of what's there and live off the land, and maybe do side jobs here and there for local logging groups, or maybe if they're really lucky, get a job at some NGO that wants to go help the region. And so a lot of the settlers, when Morioka bought the land in 1990, there was probably like maybe 50 or 60 people living out on the land. And today there's something like 5,000. So a lot of it is settlers, a lot of it's just family expansion. And I talked to the community leaders in that region, and They are literally getting new settlers coming in every week. And they said it's basically out of control at this point in time because they don't have a place for them and they have no way to stop them because they don't know who's who. They don't know where they're coming from. Mm-hmm. And these are really a lot of non-traditional people basically becoming traditional people. And they're not there to set up industrial cattle farms. They are literally there just to find like peace of mind and some serenity because they just couldn't make it in these bustling Amazon cities.
What's the difference between them and an illegal logger?
The illegal loggers are there for the wood, and a settler is there for eating fish and most likely growing like cassava and turning that into flour and shipping that to the city to make a little money. They're totally on different spectrums.
Yeah, but a settler will deforest a little bit. They have to chop some trees and clear some land.
Their cycles, typically each family might do 7 hectares.
Mm-hmm.
And they plant 1 hectare one year and then they abandon it and then plant another hectare the next year and abandon it. It's a 7-year cycle in many cases. Anthropologists have studied their habits. Some of them do a little bit more. I've seen some that have 50 hectares. I've seen others that have 2 hectares. What they do is they burn their field and they plant that specific field as in their next planting. And that's where education could come help them because all of the evidence shows that burning a field before planting actually takes some of the kilocalories out of the land. Mm-hmm. You know, it removes the nutrients instead of adds them. Because a lot of people, and even myself probably 20 years ago, would look at that dark soot from like a fire and say, oh, that's great. The next harvest is going to be great because we just burnt all that foliage. And it's actually not helpful at all. They just burnt nutrients out. It would be better to do it anyway.
No, but that's important. You came into this situation where you had illegal loggers, you had settlers, you had threats to the land, and you had a couple of different means of trying to combat the threat. I know this is all outlined in the project design documents, but can you summarize the 3 or 4 different vectors that you developed to try to save the forest and help the people, help the settlers?
My big fear was that the settlers or the traditional people were going to be approached by illegal loggers as well as land invaders, people like industrial land grabbers, people who want to grab immense areas. And they would have these groups come in and say, hey, listen, you each can get 1,000 hectares. Let us pay you to use your tax ID number, your Brazilian tax ID number. And we're going to help you guys each get 1,000 hectares. And then after that, you're going to transfer it to us. So my biggest fear, probably in like the 2014 and 15 range, was that this program called Terra Legal would be abused and that these proponents of abuse would take 1,000 families and basically claim all of the Morioka land using this program, and thus they would lose it. They would lose it to land grabbing. And so to counter that, by the time we had a little money in 2018, I paid for every family in the region. And I'm not talking about just Moriokas. I paid for every family to access the environmental registry program so that they could get their plot. And the average size plot we did was around 70 hectares per family. And this program, that made so many people go berserk because a lot of people imagined I was doing exactly what I thought they would do. So they thought that, oh, this American's going here, he helped 2,200 families, each get 70 hectares each, which is like 155,000 hectares, entered into this governmental program, and this American's going to come there and take all their land from them after they've officially gained title. And this is how the mindset is there. And because people always think, this guy's trying to land grab that guy's trying to land grab this.
Though that was your fear, and you countered it by getting the car, right? Okay.
Yeah, got countered by getting the car for each family, and 91% accepted it. The 9% that didn't, there was 3 primary rivers in the region, and those rivers were dominated by illegal loggers. The river's name is Mandaquari, Piri, and I forget the last name. It was next to Maranhão. And so those 3 rivers, all the families rejected it. and because there was a constant movement of illegal barges coming in and out of those locations, so the families had a deal in place where they were getting a little money to cooperate with the illegal loggers. If it wasn't for those three rivers, which we couldn't really get a good grasp on, we would have been able to get probably around 99% acceptance in the region for this program. When the project got approved, and this was later in 2021, we obviously sold the credits. Not as high. I wish I had waited just 3 months to sell them.
Yeah, I know.
Don't want to get into that.
Well, we will get into that.
Painful.
We will get into that. We'll get into that later. I'm sorry.
We wanted to do 30 checkpoints. So there's 30 tributary rivers in the region. There's a river network. So you have the primary rivers of Anapu, and then you have the other river, Pacajá. These are massive rivers. We're talking, at some points, they're 13 kilometers wide. And then there's 30 tributary rivers that feed into those that are in the region. So what I really wanted to do, probably in that same time, 2018, I wanted to put a security checkpoint with surveillance cameras at the mouth of each river. And the goal there was basically to track logging barges. And we spoke to the police officer, and he's like, those aren't going to last. I mean, you're going to build them, and before you could ever build them all, they're just going to get burnt out. You're not going to have cameras on those rivers. So what we decided to do was we sold the credits, and we wanted to build 20 schools. So we built an ecological brick factory in Portel in the city because there was no bricks anywhere. We would have to import everything. And we didn't want to use these kiln created bricks where basically they burn a bunch of wood or charcoal, and they kiln bake these bricks, which are incredibly unsustainable. And so we did ecological brick factory and hired a bunch of people, and we started making our own bricks, and we signed contracts with 5 different construction companies, and it turned out that 1.5 of those companies was actually capable.
Yeah.
But that's a whole nother story.
Now we will get into it.
We were going to start with 20 schools. The total plan was around 30 schools. So we would have one at each one of these rivers. And basically, by having a big school in location instead of just a security office, you would have the community there who would embrace those schools, protect the schools. And so when the illegal loggers get mad about cameras, they're not going to tear down the entire thing. They might just take down the surveillance equipment, but that's easily replaceable. And we were looking at different ways to have like hidden cameras facing the river so they wouldn't actually know that we were going to be watching the river and monitoring their barge traffic. But if we were able to have one camera at each one of those tributaries, we would be able to know every barge where it was at any given time in the region, because they never load up their ill-gotten wood on the main rivers. They always go up some side river to do it. And we wanted to track that and put eyes on it, basically. And that was the plan. And we did file lawsuits.
I was going to say, you talk about the lawsuits too.
Yeah. So in 2021, in August, we saw minor land grabbing. And this was a situation where a group had faked a power of attorney of Jonas Morioka and removed his certified real estate survey that was registered with the Federal Land Agency of INCRA. So INCRA is like this agency that oversees land-related matters. And if you own land, you have to have a survey registered with them. And basically, INCRA knows where your land is, and other federal agencies like the IBAMA, the environmental police, would know, and then the tax agency would know, and everybody basically knows where your land is. So they had faked Jonas Morioka's power of attorney and removed the certification of, I think it was 3 different properties. So in all forms and fashion, I told Morioka we will fund lawsuits, and we funded something like 240 lawsuits. And I shouldn't say they were all lawsuits. 80 of them were police denunciations. So it was 1/3 civil, 1/3 criminal, and 1/3, I'm not sure exactly the terminology in English, but it was basically like a official like complaint to the environmental police in Belém, the main capital in the state, Belém do Pará. And so we did these 80 denunciations about this land grabbing. And I mean, we basically annihilated them. Their entire plan was quashed. And that actually worked for temporarily against those land grabbers.
You know, I went back through my Skype history, and you and I have been talking since 2015. So I was experiencing this in real time. I remember when you pivoted at one point from this idea of putting up cameras to then building schools that could have cameras embedded in them, to having population centers at the entry and exit points. So this, I can vouch for the fact that this was an evolving concept. And that's why it was so weird when this outfit called the World Rainforest Movement published a report called Neocolonialism in the Amazon, which had a lot of objectively false statements in it, which I'll need a whole episode to go through. But they basically made 3 accusations against you. One is that you are, in fact, a land grabber, that you're doing these car registrations to aggregate the land and then snatch it, and also that you built the schools and put the cameras in to spy on local people. That's directly contrary to everything you've told me. And 2 is that you've undertaken no activities to reduce deforestation. And 3rd, really a corollary of the second, is that you haven't had an impact on deforestation. I'm not going to ask you to address them because, in a way, this entire conversation is a refutation of those charges. But assuming you're telling the truth, and they're not, why would they come after you like this?
Basically, there's a status quo in this region of Portel. And we have to base it, for the last 40 years, 95% of the economy is connected to, directly or indirectly, the logging trade. So there's no other money coming into Portel besides what is wood exiting Portel. And so anybody who comes in and is going to upset the status quo is going to have the status quo come back and bite them. And in my specific case, we did work in a quiet way because we knew if we asked permission, we were going to have the barriers put up in front of us quicker. So I never asked permission to anybody saying, hey, by the way, I'm going to come in and help all these impoverished families gain this mandatory obligatory certificate that for some reason nobody in the region seems to want them to have. That's a good case of the resource curse. And probably when I first talked to you in 2015, I probably talked about this. There's a lot of reports about evictions of traditional families from the region because they had no document with their name on it. And so they were being evicted when they, how do you put it, either play ball with the loggers or get out. And that was basically the status quo. And play ball is, we're going to pay you 50 cents for that $5,000 tree. And you're going to tell us where that tree is. And the illegal loggers had a free army of impoverished people desperate for money to go into the forest and search out these trophy trees that are incredibly valuable. So I did upset the status quo. And for everything I did, it was tit for tat. I did something, they did something back. I did something, they did something back. And for the first one was I was getting these police reports against me saying I was a land grabber when we were helping traditional people. The other one was a lot of the NGOs in the region, these non-governmental organizations, were going around and they were basically towing the line of illegal loggers stating that, oh, he's tricking you, he's trading you a stove for your property. So we were giving out these stoves and the NGOs were telling, don't accept the stove because it automatically means you're giving up your land rights to this American and he's going to take your land. And I'm just thinking to myself, that makes no sense. What do I want their land for? I live in the United States. I'm trying to help them. I don't want their land. I'm giving them a stove because I want them to be able to basically be more efficient when they're cooking, not use so much wood.
Well, you did end up owning a lot of land down there.
We can get into that. That was titled property that was won in a lawsuit. So that land had no people on it. It was away from the river. Jonas Morioka owed me a debt. Basically, I was working for him for free for years. And in, I think it was 2012, he said he would pay me in land. He didn't pay me in land. So in 2014, I sued him. And in 2017, he settled the lawsuit in front of a judge. And He paid me 47,000 hectares of titled property. None of the property had any people on it. The titles at the time of receipt were not canceled. The titles had tax records at the time of receipt, was 27 years of tax payments. And all the lands I received were registered with the federal government.
Yeah, we'll get to that, but you were talking about the stoves.
Yeah, so the stoves, they basically came up with every rumor possible to stop us from helping the population get this certificate from this Norwegian-funded governmental program. And it was shocking. And I would say that this is a perfect example of a resource curse, where you have the loggers, who are a very small group, maybe like 10 groups altogether, controlling all the wood trade in this region. And then you have around 50,000 inhabitants of the region who need to be basically kept in this status quo. And so little old me came along and said, hey, let's help people get education. Let's go build 20 schools. And another thing that we tried to do, and it was really hard, was drill 1,500 water wells. So every individual house or every community would have at least one well, and they could stop drinking from the rivers. So we started that. We actually paid for 500, but we only got 97. And that's a whole nother story, because as you're aware of, and we'll probably get into, is we had this huge, out of 100 and probably about 100 people working, 9 of them were a part of this embezzlement scheme that they infiltrated my company and embezzled a lot of money.
Understanding the lay of the land, so to speak, is critical, literally and figuratively. And what you mentioned about NGOs taking things out of context, it's something I've seen play out firsthand. And it even happens NGO to NGO. When I was in Kenya, going back to 2014 or so, WWF Netherlands had this program, Payments for Watershed Services program, where they were working with flower growers at the base of a really steep, hilly area. And the idea was to get these flower growers to pay farmers higher up on the hills to improve the land management. And it was an impressive program. They introduced terraced farming, which massively improved land productivity up in the hills, while also reducing agricultural runoff, which is exactly what the flower growers needed to protect their own operations downstream. But then you had another NGO that was active in the same area, and I do know the name of this NGO, and the local people told me it was, I'm not going to mention because I didn't verify, but it was a well-known global NGO coming in and stirring the pot. And they were telling people, hey, don't take those payments. If you do, they're going to take your land. It was completely misleading, and it undermined the whole initiative. And unfortunately, this kind of thing happens more often than we'd like to admit. There are certain, we call them activist NGOs that seem more focused on creating conflict or pushing an ideological agenda than on finding practical solutions. It's a huge challenge within the climate community, balancing the good work that some organizations do with the disruption caused by others who just stir things up.
This is exactly what happened in Portel. We helped 2,200 families, about 14,000 inhabitants. That's like 400,000 acres. And they said, he's not getting you title. He's promising you title. You're not getting title. You're getting the car. And this,
that's true, though. Car is not a title, right? I mean,
it's not a title, right? But we had, and I told my staff, before we even were really outright accused of this, I told my staff, when you deliver this car, you make sure you film it and make sure you don't say it's a title. So we filmed hundreds of the deliveries to make sure this is a car, this is the benefits, and nobody said it was a title. When they came after me, these NGOs, along with some government officials, were like, oh, he's promising them the title, and it's not the title. Now, what we were doing was we were talking to the government, a different government that was in favor of helping these people get the title. And we spoke to them, and we were looking for a pathway to take that car and help the individual families get title with it. But we were stopped before we could actually get that far. The end goal was obviously to help them get the title for each family.
Yeah. And that was, because I was confused by that. I think the project design document did say the title was or some kind of shared title
There's a step to it. So step one, whenever you want to get a title, is you first get the Cadastro Ambiental Rural. You don't even
Which is
need
the
to
car.
do yeah, which is the car. And that's this declaratory, this is my plot, this is my possession, or this is my title. Some people, if you have a title, you have to get this as well. But this is what is I consider mine. And that is this declaration. And step two is getting a survey. And I think President Lula, when he first got elected that first June, so it was June of 2023, I think it was, he came up with a decree, and I've looked for it on the internet, but I saw the news headline, but I never saw it after that. They are allowed to go to the registry office with a car and claim up to 50 hectares in an extrajudicial fashion. So these traditional people can technically go in there and basically say, hey, listen, I have my car. I would like to have my title now. Can you help me? And so Lula was working on that, and I'm not sure what happened to it. If an American goes to any one of these regions, especially Portel, which is caught up in the resource curse, there's going to be pushback. And wow, we got a lot of pushback. I was getting death threats from logging groups. We have recordings of death threats. And it's not fun.
Yeah, I saw a lot of that when I was working with the Paitas Souderie, the first indigenous-led red project back in 2009. I just want to make sure people are clear on the fact that we're not going to solve the whole problem of tangled titles in today's episode. But
my theory is things got settled down in 2006. For the most part, in 2006, there was not a lot of land left to be grabbed because everything was kind of, this is mine, this is yours. Everybody kind of knew where it was, even though it wasn't really defined in a title or not. And then people weren't content with that. And prior to 2006, the majority of the land grabbing took place on public land. So it was always public land being land grabbed because it was like a no man's land. Nobody actually owned it. Hey, we want to go somewhere that's not a federal reserve, not a state reserve, and not indigenous territory. It's like a no man's public land. And so people would go in there, grab it. And then post 2006 was when the land grabbing of private property started occurring. And I personally believe that was instigated. I'm not going to say by who, because I don't want to offend anybody, but we didn't see a lot of private property being invaded prior to 2006. Yes, it did occur, because you're going to have some scientists, oh, there's that one case back in 2003 and 2002, and you don't know what you're talking about. So yeah, there was definitely private property being invaded prior to this date, but most of the land grabbing in the Amazon region was people settling the region from 1960 to the 2006, and basically in 2006, the big tracts of land were gone that could have been invaded.
Can we get back to the genesis and really go back, way back in time, to before you came to the Amazon, when you were just a kid, and Jonas Morioka buys the land in 1990. You're up in Michigan.
Yeah, I'm in elementary school, probably like 6th grade or something. I don't know.
Your dad's a local public defender or prosecutor? I forget.
At this stage, he probably would have been U.S. federal prosecutor in Grand Rapids.
Okay, so you're a kid in Grand Rapids, and Jonas Morioka, he's a pretty wealthy Japanese physician. He's also working with this Japanese land company that you described, and they decide they're going to make an investment in timberland, right?
Well, the story that I was told was that they took 10 years to look for the perfect property. He was working for years, was having a very hard time finding a property that would pass the title review. And so when they found the one in Portel, they said they did 2 years of due diligence on it, and then they bought it January 20th, 1990.
Okay. And it's a lot of land. We talk about a property, it's huge. What's the total?
At the time, it was probably around 1.7 million acres.
Okay. How many hectares is that then?
700,000.
That's huge. That's bigger than the Souderie indigenous territory that I thought was a massive area.
It wasn't that big when we started, though. In 2012, when I signed the contract for Rio Napupakaja, 300,000 was already gone, already deforested.
By him in his earlier days?
No, by illegal land grabbers who invaded the area, turned it to cattle farms.
Okay, and the modus operandi is pretty well known. It's they come in, They do timber harvesting, often illegally, which degrades the land. And in the old days, they used to be able to degrade it to the point that it was no longer considered a forest, and then it's cleared for farming, and you can go from forest, and then maybe they'll burn it or something. There's a whole sequence, and they do cattle farming, and then they do soy. This has just been, these patterns have been playing out across Brazil, Indonesia, and other countries for a long time.
Yeah, I think it will eventually make it to soy. So from when it's forest to soy, it takes about 5 years. You need 5 years of cattle farming before you could even consider doing a soybean farm, because they just burnt it all. They got to build up the biomass in the soil. And also, if you're going to start tilling the soil, there's all these roots there. They got to let those degrade a little bit as a cattle farm. And, that will happen with the cattle stomping on them and eating, and all this incredibly invasive grass, this capim grass that they use in Brazil. It really kind of builds up the biomass in the soil for that conversion over to the soybean farms. But that's the whole farming question.
What drew you down to this area? Because you went down there. I guess I've got two other questions here. One is, why did Morioka decide to stop doing timber at this point? He says he just had a change of heart. I don't know if that... I'm always skeptical of things like that.
No, I don't think so. And they would kill me for me to say the truth. What I think it is, I think he got kicked out. I think that the loggers that he was working with basically said, we don't want to work with you anymore. We're going to continue cutting. We don't need you. And that was going on to, we're going to be really jumping around there. That was probably in 2006 is when he was getting a lot of this fake news and fake attacks that he was a land grabber. And I think a lot of those news stories were pushed by his partners who wanted Jonas out of the area so that they could cut and not have to pay him basically the toll. And I've spoken to certain individuals who are part of these logging associations, and I mentioned the name Morioka, and they're like, oh, don't even tell me that name. Don't even go there. Like, when he was gone, they were really happy.
The illegal loggers were happy.
Yeah, because they could cut his land and not have to pay him a toll or a fee.
Gotcha. Okay. And again, this is speculation. I want to.
This is theory. This is
it's theory, and I want to make everything that's theory clear because I just don't have the bandwidth to be digging into these cans of worms. So we can say here's a theory, unproven, but it's out there. Take it or leave it.
He had a well-tuned logging operation there that was based on 21 or 22 different contract logging companies that contracted certain regions of this massive area, 1.7 million acres, to cut. They grouped together, in my opinion, and they said, we're not going to pay you anymore. Tough luck. It was in the tens of millions every year.
And from that perspective, if that's true, the motive is, well, if I can't chop it, nobody can chop it.
Yeah, basically, probably. But that's the motive to life, right? And we're going to get into that. If it's not my carbon credit project, it's nobody's carbon credit project.
If I can't save it, nobody can save it.
And that's what happened to the embezzlers in my company. They said that to us. They if it's not ours, it's nobody's. Because they told us we're going to take your projects, and if it's not ours, it's nobody's.
Quick note, if our referencing of the embezzler by this title, just calling him the embezzler instead of using his name, is annoying, well, I get that, and we will fix that in the next installment for reasons I'll get into then. I should point out that other reporters have visited the area and told me that Michael's version of things holds up. And hey, if you're enjoying Bionic Planet and want to hear more high-quality episodes, you can help make that happen by becoming a patron. Just head over to patreon.com/Bionic Planet. That's patreon.com/Bionic Planet. Bionic Planet, all one word, no dots or dashes. There you can support the show for as little as $1 per episode with an option to set a monthly cap. So it's flexible and affordable. Thanks for being part of the journey. So 2008, for whatever reason, Jonas Morioka decides he wants to conserve the land. And whatever the motivation is, he makes his decision. And at the same time, you're getting involved in conservation. And you've heard about the emergence of Red Plus, which were these methodologies didn't even exist. And how did you know about this stuff? What?
I read the BBC News. That was my go-to news website. And I actually read about it, and probably, I can't remember when they did the story. I tried to find the story because they have a pretty good backlog of all their old stories, and it was probably 2007 or 2008. And I pulled the trigger in 2008 and went to Manaus, and you didn't know anybody, and showed up at Koyab, which at the time was kind of like agnostic on the topic of red carbon credit projects, and they set me up.
Explain what Koyabi is.
Koyabi is like the council, like it's a non-governmental council for like indigenous people in the Brazilian Amazon, and it's probably their principal organization. And at the time they were agnostic, and they were actually open to it. Recently, they've taken more of red is bad.
Yeah, I'm actually pretty familiar with Koyabi, and in Koyabi again, it's just the Portuguese pronunciation. I always put that little at the end. And it's interesting. The indigenous leaders themselves have generally been agnostic when it comes to Red Plus, but their funders, that's a different story. Those groups have often been ideologically opposed to it. And in the case of Koyabi, they used to get a lot of support from CIMI, that's the Indigenous Missionary Council, which not only provided their offices, but some of their funding. And CIMI, in turn, got its funding from the Ford Foundation, and I don't think the Ford Foundation really knew everything that CIMI was up to, because, they're one of these shape-shifting organizations. On the one hand, they did incredible work, especially back in the 70s, to help get indigenous lands demarcated, which was essential. But over time, they became paternalistic. One thing that Elmir Sudari, the chief who led the creation of the first Red Project, he had a great quote where he said, "They came to see us as their little Indians, and if we misbehaved, they punished us." And it was pretty true. I first saw this firsthand in 2009 when the Sudari decided they wanted to participate in Red Plus, and CIMI was completely against it. And they told the Sudari, hey, no, you can't do that. And it wasn't just a simple disagreement. Their tactics were really heavy-handed. I've written about this before, and it's a classic example of how these dynamics play out, where outside organizations end up dictating to indigenous communities instead of empowering them. But anyway, I digress. You went to Koyabi.
Yeah, I went to Koyabi, and they said the Santa Larga was the group that was most interested in a project. They set up some meetings. We met with them, and at the time I had an investment group from Florida who really was like backing the idea of a project, and I was more so like a broker. So I would find the group that wanted the project and find the investor that wanted to develop it.
But how did you get into that position? How did you come in?
By showing up and knocking on the door.
Okay.
Basically. Not too many Americans show up in the middle of the Amazon and knock on the door of Koyab. And by the way, I want to do something you've never heard of before. Let's give it a try. Put those two together. The Florida group didn't want me involved. Basically, they didn't want to pay me.
What was the Florida group?
There's a company called Viridor.
Okay, I remember that.
Yeah. They were accused of buying the Santa Larga 2 trucks to try to like buy their...
Viridor, and there was another group called Celestial Green or something from Ireland, I think, weren't they mixed up in
that? That was Munduruku.
Okay.
No, there are two issues that they did was, and Viridor bought them the trucks, and that wasn't per se any issues. I don't know when they bought it. When they bought it, if they bought the trucks for the purpose of getting their contract signed, yeah, that would have been like a OIT or International Labor Organization 169 rights violation. If they had bought them for the purpose of getting a contract signed, I was already out. After August of 2009, I wasn't involved in any way with the Santa Larga project. But those trucks, I think, were bought in like 2010 or 11. And for the Celestial Green Ventures, and I've seen their contract, it was a whopper. Yeah. It was with the Munduruku, and it basically said, I hereby cede all of the territory rights of the land of the Munduruku to Celestial Green Ventures. And I was just in complete shock that, it was such an incredibly abusive contract with an indigenous group by this company. And I don't know, reading news stories, you can never believe anything when there's a negative news story. But supposedly Celestial Green Venture didn't use Vera. They just came up with their own concept for carbon credits, and they sold like millions of credits at $1 each. Yeah, I don't know. They might have sold nothing, so we never will know.
Yeah, it's foggy in my memory right now, but if I remember correctly, they got into trouble for selling credits without any sort of methodology behind them at all. And they also, what I can say, is that they whether intentionally or inadvertently, they created a lot of confusion on the ground. The Cintalarga, maybe the Zorro, they're both neighboring peoples, were getting trucks from day one, and they never even generated carbon credits, but they were getting trucks. And there was a perception that this was essentially a bribe for the leaders. Again, I haven't investigated this, but this was the perception. Meanwhile, the Sudari, they'd self-imposed a logging moratorium before the methodology was even finalized. So they were getting nothing. They were making a huge sacrifice, and they were getting nothing in return. They did get a grant from the Annenberg Foundation to map their territory, which kept them going, but they weren't seeing any actual REDD Plus money yet. And that just created so much intrigue and frustration within the community. And, one reason I'm diving into all this detail is that it highlights an important point. Once money is involved, it attracts people who just smell it, and not always in a good way. There are carbon cowboys out there who aren't acting in good faith, and they can really mess things up. And at the same time, there are plenty of people trying to do the right thing. So while skepticism is understandable, it's important to look at the actual evidence and figure out who's acting in good faith and who isn't. And that's what we're trying to unpack here.
But we should not knock Viridor because we don't know when the trucks were provided. If they were provided to get the contract signed, that would be basically a bribe. If it was provided after the contract was signed because the project determined there was a need for having trucks for surveillance, then that would be a project necessity for monitoring. And we actually sold 2 trucks. They did not get given to the Cintalarga. We actually sold 2 trucks to the Cintalarga as well, but this was way after our contracts were signed. They were about
those are the trucks. Are those the trucks that your embezzler tried to claim as his own?
I never even knew that they were going to the Cintalarga, but the embezzler stole 2 trucks from my company and sold them to the Cintalarga without my knowledge, without my permission.
And we'll loop back to that.
That's like the embezzler. Like, it's beyond that. And when he sold them to the Cintalarga, they have bank loans on them. So, he committed so many federal violations, laws by doing that.
And we'll get to that. I was worried that you'd be the one going off on tangents, but I'm the one who's taking us off tangent. And it's because I didn't realize that you were active with the Cintalarga at that point. The Cintalarga territory, again, it's right next to the Sudari territory. And both of these peoples, I know the Sudari better, but they have multiple factions, just like any community. Like my neighborhood here in Chicago, and like any family, they're not monolithic. And they had a pro-logging faction and an anti-logging faction, and then they had a massive faction in the middle that would be like the undecideds in our voting system. And the infuriating thing was that the pro-logging faction was basically spreading all kinds of rumors about the pro-red faction, claiming they were getting paid already and pocketing the money and things like that. And the pro-logging faction was also getting support from CME. So it's ironic that this group that claims to be looking out for indigenous people and protecting them from the evils of the market economy were supporting the most evil element of the market economy and stifling any engagement with what I would consider to be a legitimate part. So you've got these illegal loggers claiming that the legal conservationists are the bad guys, and the point here is that those trucks, they became part of that narration.
They are good.
That campaign
they are convincing.
Within the Sudari.
Yeah, I was in Manaus. I was living in Manaus, and I found a few real estate people in the region, and I had them start setting up meetings with large landowners. And most of the landowners in the state of Pará are pretty remote. They're not in what we call the arc of deforestation, and that is the southeast. Basically take the cattle farms and go inland about 100 miles, and this is this line that kind of borders the Amazon, where all the deforestation takes place in the Brazilian Amazon. And so none of these properties were there, and then I was introduced to an attorney named Miguel Bahela. And Miguel Bahela, I went to his house, and he said, through UBS, I think it was UBS or Deutsche Bank, a banker I know, friend, knows a landowner named Jonas Morioka, and I want to introduce you. And he never actually introduced me, but he did, I think, get the message to Morioka about my contact, and the Moriokas actually contacted me around June 9th of 2009. And at the time, they had 1.5 million hectares, so twice as much as they actually have. That's what I was told, probably misinformation. Things get exaggerated and whatnot. And so the original deal was I would help them sell their land. You know, I didn't really know them, and I had a really good client from Germany that I really liked a lot. And I introduced those two. And that was a deal that could have happened, but it didn't. It fell apart. And then after that fell apart, we had a guy named Kevin Tremaine from England. He contacted my website, and I introduced him with the Moriokas, and they ended up making the ADPML Red Project, or otherwise known as Pacajai Red Project, together. And that is one of those projects in Portel that is now become under the spotlight. And then I also introduced Morioka to Ron Dewhurst for the RMDLT Red Project in Portel. And I really wanted to develop those projects. I was an engineer, but I was an engineer that was doing real estate. So what they did was they actually contacted Rainforest Alliance. And Rainforest Alliance actually had an Excel sheet of all qualified red developers. And they had this sheet, and on that sheet was a company called Ecosystem Services, LLC, out of Washington. It was run by a Peruvian named Gonzalo Castro. And both Ron and Kevin hired Gonzalo Castro to develop their project. And I really had no involvement at all. I gave some ancillary support to them, question and answers, and basically acted like an intermediary between Morioka and them. On a lot of these answers, they would ask me, oh, tell me about this with the land, tell me about that. And I would go back to Morioka and be like, hey, you got a bunch of these questions. Can you help me with them? And then I would give them the answers. So I was an unpaid consultant. And what was weird was, and this is how I got paid land, what was weird was I never got paid for any of it. I wasn't getting paid by Kevin. I wasn't getting paid by Ron. I was working literally unpaid, uncontracted, answering all these questions all the time for this company, Ecosystem Services, LLC. And in 2012, I told Jonas Morioka, I'm quitting. I can't be involved anymore. I have to move on with my life because this is costing me a fortune. I gave up a career as an engineer in the United States to be down here, and I'm not making any money. And so what happened was Morioka said, no, stay. At the time, I had 3.6 million reais in debt from basically just helping out. It was $1.8 million just by, basically working for free from 2009 to 2012. And I also had staff as well who I was funding. They basically gave me what they felt their land was worth at the time, a guarantee at 90 reais per hectare to cover that debt. And it was 40,000 hectares, about 100,000 acres in a guarantee.
Yeah, it sounds like you've stolen my business plan. Work for free.
and
go into debt and hope that somebody comes and bails, that gives you a chunk of land.
No, we have the same business plan, and I'm going to tell you why. Because my wife every says, you're the number one free source of information on the Amazon. Stop working for people for free. And it literally is my life from 2008 till basically 2021 is I just accumulated debt.
Yeah.
It'll happen, Steve. You're going to get bailed out. Some rich guy.
Somebody, maybe Jeff Bezos. I don't know.
Bezos is going to, Bezos, the Earth Fund, is going to see the value in your podcast, and he's going to say, here you go.
Yeah, and this is a great time to remind people that I do have a Patreon page. It's patreon.com/Bionic Planet. That's patreon.com/Bionic Planet. Bionic Planet, all one word, no dots or dashes. There you can support the show for as little as $1 per episode, but with a monthly cap. And of course, I'd really appreciate more than $1 per episode. And I'm really looking for sponsors who want to come in at a high enough level to give me the ability to generate the kind of well-produced shows that I think will make a difference. And the biggest complaint I get on Bionic Planet is I don't produce enough episodes. There's a big gap between episodes because I take the time to try to do them right, and then I have to make my living doing other things. And if you do want to become a sponsor of the show, you can reach out to me at steve@bionic-planet.com. That's steve@bionic-planet.com. Thanks, Michael, for queuing that little commercial up for me. Now back to your business and how you got started in this. You mentioned Kevin Tremaine from the UK, Ron Dewhurst from Canada, but I'm not sure how you came in contact with them.
Yeah, so let me give a background of what I did. So I was an engineer. I worked in the auto industry. I worked for Toyota. I worked for Honda. I worked for Johnson Controls. I was in the corporate world, and for fun, as a hobby, I had a Brazilian real estate website that had 15,000 properties on it. And it was like a Zillow of Brazil. And the biggest mistake I made from a business standpoint is it was catering to foreigners, expats. And that was the stupidest thing I probably ever did, because if I had turned that into actual Zillow for Brazilians, I probably would have never even gone into red, because it was a massive website with thousands of properties all over the country, and it was generating a huge amount of traffic for foreigners. But if I had focused it for Brazilians, it would have been amazing, because at the time in Brazil, in this 2007, 2008 time period, there was literally very little online real estate. It was 10 years behind the US. So that's why I was getting all these foreigners contacting me to do red. It wasn't that I was specifically advertising red. It was that I was specifically advertising Brazilian real estate. And it just was coincidence that I was wanting to do red and I had this website.
Okay. So Kevin gets in touch with you, and now you're in touch with the Moriokas, and then you went and you found Ron Dewhurst up in Canada, I guess, because you're up in that.
No, he came to the website as well.
Okay, that makes sense. And then ultimately 4 different projects come out of this, 3 of which eventually get validated under Vera, 1 of which never does. And the first one we want to talk about is the 80 PML project, which later changed its name to Pakajai. That was yours, right?
No, that's not me. No, that's Kevin's.
Yeah. These acronyms confused the hell out of me. Maybe just give me a quick overview on that specific project, and for the sake of simplicity, we'll just call it Kevin's project from here on in to keep it simple.
It's a big project, 123,000 hectares. It's on this northern point of the municipality of Portel. It was developed by Ecosystem Services, LLC, and then after that, KMS Group was the developer.
KMS is the Indian group, right?
Yeah, Indian group. So they're like the infamous Indian developer.
They've
actually
done
like a ton of projects and have a highly interesting portfolio. We'll just say that.
Well, they became infamous for uploading these project proposals to the Vera registry for projects in places like Papua New Guinea, projects that were essentially dead on arrival for a lot of reasons, but were often treated in some media as being up and running. And it was another one of these goofy things where public discourse diverged dramatically from reality.
Well, what they were trying to do, the big one was a 74 million hectare project in the Congo, and I think there was a 23 million hectare project in Bolivia. And the 74 million hectare project in the Congo would produce 2 billion credits a year. And now that's wrong, because just in the Amazon as a forest, 60% of all tropical rainforests in the world only is putting out between 400 and 500 million tons of carbon each year from the deforestation. So how would a project in the Congo on 74 million hectares, an area much smaller than the Amazon forest, produce so many more credits than the Amazon forest emits, basically? There's no science behind it, but behind what they tried to do. That project in the Congo, I actually looked at it, I looked at the maps, and it probably, if it was a real project, would probably issue between 7 and 12 million credits per year, because it was relatively isolated. There was some periphery areas that would have threat to it, but in general, it was not a threatened area. But they tried to get that through, and I think That's where the cowboys come in. And cowboys are exploiters. They're trying to exploit the system from various aspects.
Yeah, and it's important because those big projects that they tried to do never got through validation. But the proposals existed, and as a result of that, the projects were reported as existing. And credible news outlets made that mistake. We're not just talking about The Guardian here.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. And so many negative headlines came up about the market because that type of stuff, the people who are against red projects can really sink their teeth into and be like, oh, look at, there they go again.
Yeah.
And I've actually emailed Vera about this and said, please, next time somebody tries to do a project that's so obviously false, don't even accept it in. You don't want to give some overzealous reporter a sensational news story that is not even news.
Yeah, and they perversely make the system less transparent. Vera's policy at the time was to publish all of these project idea notes in the interest of transparency. This way you can put everything that comes in out there where it can be critiqued. And then, of course, documents like these get uploaded and they get critiqued, and the critiques go viral as proof of something nefarious when it's really part of the vetting process, the kind of crowd-sourced vetting process. And, Vera eventually began to review documents before uploading them just to avoid this, so that those that were obviously not going to fly wouldn't even show up on the site. But I always wondered why an organization would even propose something that is so obviously never going to fly. I mean, one theory, and again, this is not my theory, it's something others have suggested, so we're in the realm of speculation again, but one theory is that they're just trying to attract investors by putting these big things up that they knew would never fly, but it would, No,
it's not that. It's greed. It's what they were doing to do those projects. It was greed and delusions of grandeur. Because remember, KMS Group, I talked to them often when it was like, and they literally believed they could get it through. And I was like, what are you guys doing? And they're like, no, they're legitimate projects. We have the government of the Congo who signed off. And I'm like, you're crazy, man.
Yeah, the PNG one is the one I remember most clearly, but the one in DRC had something similar where the project never flew, but comments on the proposal ended up getting into articles about things that were wrong with red. It was just really annoying.
No, they did that. They did a Papua New Guinea one as well. And I think actually that one actually made it pretty far. I'm not sure what happened to it today. I don't follow it. But
it didn't get that far. The numbers were ridiculous. Even just at first glance, they just...
Money. Imagine saying, I'm going to have 2 million or 2 billion carbon credits. No, there's no buyers for that. Nobody's going to believe it.
But that's just so...
I think,
yeah, but that's,
for my experience, because I have a significant number of projects, you can't feasibly do a project over 1 million acres because the ability to execute on monitoring and the ability to control the territory is just too complicated from a quantification standpoint if it's over 1 million. How do you quantify 74 million hectares in the Congo? There's no way. They don't have probably the same level of readily available government data as Brazil. And in Brazil, you have a lot of government data that you can pull from to help in monitoring. But in the Congo, you're going to be, because we were just consulting on another project, and the person who hired us was like, okay, I need you to do GIS mapping, satellite picture for satellite picture. And I'm like, oh, wait, our company doesn't do that. We write reports and we'll do the calculations. You have to get us the raw data. Mm-hmm. And in Brazil, the raw data is already there. In the Congo, it's not there. You have to physically come up with it. It was impossible to do that. It was impossible to do that project, yeah.
The objective on this has always been jurisdictional accounting and jurisdictional read with projects nested inside. And the idea individual projects were seen as ways of encouraging early action and testing new methodologies. And data availability was a huge reason for not going ahead with jurisdictional initiatives until now. Very few countries are at that point. And again, I'm digressing, but I wanted to mention that because you had brought up KMS and it triggered me. So that was the first one. It was Kevin's.
Yeah, KMS was their developer after.
Okay.
And then I became the third developer, but I never issued any credits for their projects. And when I took over the projects, there was a lot of things that had to be done.
Okay, I guess I wanted to go through each of them individually, but maybe we should touch on this because so ADPML, or Kevin's project, you were acting in this kind of unpaid consulting role for them, and then you became a project developer at some point later. I thought it was 2021. Am I wrong on that?
Yeah, so January of 2021, it was agreed between Morioka and Kevin that I would take over for 18 months the project to do the development. You know, the only things we did was we started construction on 7 schools in his project area.
Why don't we stick a pin in that and come back to it? Because we want to get the other projects in people's heads too.
Yeah, so
Okay.
RMDLT, we took over probably on, it was actually, I never signed a contract with Kevin or with Ron for the RMDLT project. And that was probably 2020. We took over after KMS, and we were trying to get the 2018 credits issued, but we never got that done either.
Okay. So tell us about our RMDLT, though. This was Ron Dewhurst, and he had gotten friends and family money, essentially. That's
basically
what I
friends and family, and they basically followed the same path as Kevin. They hired Ecosystem Services and then KMS Group. And out of the group that made most of the money for Ron's project was actually Ecosystem Services because they were charging so much. You know, when they sold the credits, it was still in debt. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah.
So we took it over. We were trying to get the credits released. But what I noticed is for both projects, Ron and Kevin's, is there was a lot of traditional people overlap in the project area. And so the first business as usual was to basically subdivide out any human population from the project area, because you really don't want to expose any project to having any type of potential conflict. And there's numerous emails with Vera where I was like, hey, we need to shrink RMDLT, we need to shrink it. I really want to go down to 151,000 hectares from 177. And then you get into the rules of Vera. You can only reduce a project at 5%. So even if I wanted to remove it, I wasn't allowed to. Otherwise, it's considered a deforestation event. And the only reason that population was actually in the projects in the first place is because Ecosystem Services, when they did the project, actually, it was so new to them, they didn't actually know. So they basically just took whatever maps the landowner gave to them, and the landowner said, here's
the Moriokas
project.
at that point.
Yeah, the Moriokas. Here's the maps of our land, and they just said, okay, here's the project. And satellite maps at the time were not that good, so you couldn't really see what was going on as we can today, where you can actually physically see houses. So a lot of this population was put in there unknowingly. And so the first order of business when I took over was we got to remove all conflicted areas of these 2 projects and make sure that there's no population there, because that's complex, right? You don't want to have, there's so many, you don't want to claim you're getting a carbon credit from a forest when it's actually a sustenance plot.
Right.
But the sustenance is not producing, it's not doing anything from a carbon standpoint. And you also, the other big reason you don't want to have traditional populations on top of a private property RED project is because of all the free prior informed consent that has to go into that. Because you physically need to go and ask everybody over and over again, do you accept this project? And then you have to do like profit sharing and all that type of aspects with the project, which are basically required. And so for Kevin's project, I basically told those guys we need to shrink it in half. So it was 123,000. I think my final maps was like 64,000 hectares, so it would shrink in half. For Ron's project, it would go from 177 down to 151,000 hectares. And Ron didn't have that much overlap. Kevin's was significantly overlapped.
Okay, and I don't want to dive too deep into those projects because we wanted to focus on yours. Before we get to yours, the other one is the Riverino project, where this was done by river people, right? What was the issue on this?
Well, there was no issue.
Well, it hasn't been approved, though, right?
No, it was withdrawn. The original project was going to be with the Union of Rural Producers as the owner, along with 1,252 families. I was a consultant. The union would be basically their representative. That was probably like 2020 or 2021. And then we hired the embezzler in early 2022. And he came up with this story that it can't be a union as an owner under the law. It has to be an association, which I talked to various attorneys and everybody gives me a different story on the legalities of this. So let's just put it this way. It was fake news from the embezzler because he wanted to take control of the project.
Okay.
Now, the project at the time, think about it, prices of credits were like $10. It was have 4 million credits. It would have made $40 million. And my company's consulting fee in it was 15%. What we invested in the project was several $1 million. We would have probably doubled our money. We would have probably made about $3 million profit on a $3 million investment. So it wasn't by Brazilian standards. Long term, these are not fast investments. You don't invest 3 and then 1 year later you get it. You invest 3 and then 5 years later you get it. So it wasn't, it was hugely risky. We've written that off now, primarily because the people who were going to be managing the money were not trustworthy and had already proven track record of embezzlement.
This is the embezzler. We're gonna.
Don't,
and you don't want to name him, right? I
don't want to name him because there's an ongoing criminal lawsuit against him and 9 other people who he's involved with, and there's several legal strategies that my attorneys are doing where we're basically picking off the weakest links so that. We already have one person who has come forward and has acknowledged the falsification of receipts, a part of the giant embezzlement they did.
Okay, we'll get into we'll get into some details on
that.
There's
all this crazy stuff with them.
Yeah, but
so
it gets confused.
Anyway, the embezzler became the proponent of that project. He basically tricked us into believing that the union couldn't own it. I set up the largest non-logging association for traditional population in Portel. It was called the Association of Ribeirinhos and Moradores. It was a huge association that did massive charitable work in the region. And I foolishly was manipulated into believing that the embezzler should be president. And so when we... long story short is that project failed because we couldn't trust anybody to manage it. And I would rather not shame Red. I would rather cancel the project and then bring further issues to Red as a marketplace.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And it's sad because imagine $34 million going into, or $34 million going into only traditional. And we had this massive budget where each family would get one salary, which is like one minimum wage salary per year for 5 years. The money was there.
Yeah. Okay. And now we'll go to your project, which is the Rio Anapu Pacaja Red project. And the timelines on this are a little bit confusing because you took ownership after the project had begun, right? Did I understand correctly that the project developers were initially, was it Kevin and Ron or?
No, this is totally wrong. So in 2012, we signed the Rio Anapu Pacaja project into contract, but we didn't bother starting the actual Vera process until much later. So the official start date of the project was 2016. And the reason we didn't start is because it was such a huge undertaking from a financial standpoint to be paying for auditors and this and that, Vera procedures. So we waited to do the project. We were doing patrolling, but we were not actually doing like the project, like any social projects. We were doing the bare minimum from 2012 to 2016. And then the official start date's 2016. It was approved in September of 2021. And then the schools and all that we can get into if you want.
I'd like to get into it. Maybe in a sequence, there's a couple of questions I want to clear up. You talked about you don't do projects where there's people on them, partly because of the FPIC, but a big part of the project was working with people, filing lawsuits on their behalf to help them get the car. So they are involved in it, right? I mean, what is the, how do you,
I have 47,000 hectares by the time that we're doing this Rio Napu Pakajat project. So I shouldn't say 47. I had 38 because my attorney, Evaldo Pinto, got 21% of my as a contingency.
Okay, so
lawsuit.
let me see, because at this point we haven't told people about how you got you alluded to it before. So I guess I'm thinking. So I got a couple of questions. Is when I'm asking about the issue of the car and everything like this. This applies to the other projects as well, right? You're getting them the car. And that is even if they're not on the project area, although you're saying in some of the other projects there was some overlap and you wanted to shrink it, but is this because they are considered drivers of deforestation, potential drivers of deforestation? What is the rationale for getting them the car, and how does that help to reduce deforestation? Just the logical flow.
The logical flow of getting them the car is because when the car is there, land grabbers typically avoid the area. So if you have a car, you're less likely to be invaded by somebody else because they're going to see that somebody's already claiming it, and 99% of land grabbers are just basically say, I'm going to go somewhere where somebody else already doesn't have a claim. Now, in Portel, you don't always get that because people are like, I don't care if you own the land, I'm going to come in anyway, and that's what people do. So the Rio Napu project was doing social outreach up to 50 miles away from the project area.
Okay.
So if you're poor and you're in that river system of the Portel region, we were there for you. And thousands of food baskets, tons of food, schools, some of the schools that we were building were not even in the project. It was far from the project, but because it was in the region and there was a needy community, we wanted to help. Now, bear in mind, there are schools in the region. There's 140 schools, but because there's so many settlers, there's so many communities that didn't have a school. So there's numerous communities that were growing too fast where the government could never keep up. So there was a huge deficit of schooling. And there was actually, and I don't know how accurate this was, I was told that there was 300 teachers living in Portel in the city, and they didn't have classrooms to work in. So even the government had the teachers available, but they just didn't have the schools for those teachers. So we were building the schools, we were starting to do the water wells, and we really wanted to be the showcase Project Red because up until this point in the world, you had Wildlife Works that had built schools, and you had another company in Ecuador that had built schools. And in general, in Brazil, there was nobody building schools en masse, and I wanted to be the example that could be embraced by everybody in the market. Hey, this is what we need to do to get these large corporations interested in our credits.
Okay, and now you mentioned Wildlife Works. I know the projects in Kenya fairly well. I featured them in a cluster of episodes around episode 88, developed by a different group, but using Wildlife Works as a consultant. That was in the Chulu Hills, which is right next door to the Kasigao Corridor project. And I'll have other episodes based on those projects. But the thing is, in those projects, the schools came out of public consultation. People were chopping trees for charcoal. And the objective was to try to reduce charcoal harvesting and reduce poaching. And so what they did is they held these focus groups and they said, hey, what do we need to do for you to stop chopping the trees? What can we do that will encourage you to do this? And what emerged from those were build schools, bring in beekeeping, give us scholarship money. So it was education for our kids and jobs. Those are the two main things. Did you undertake anything like that?
No, it wasn't. Never. It was to get security and forward operating bases in the middle of nowhere. Because
Gotcha, right.
Portel is a massive area. It is basically about 6 million acres. So there was almost no police presence in there, and that's how the status quo wanted it. What we needed to do was get these schools out there that had security offices and cameras and basically be the forward operating base for having permanent security out there closer to where, because I'm like basically a engineer from the automotive industry working at like Japanese companies, Toyota and Honda, they always have the saying, go to the place. You have to go there. So we had to go to the place to get the, our eyes on it. And having eyes there would deter a lot of these legal loggers. Like I said, the school, we wanted to just do checkpoints, but those would have they would have gotten firebombed pretty quickly. So the schools, nobody's going to firebomb a school out there. That just happens to have a security office.
Yeah, I remember you explaining that to me. Now, this idea of having the school strategically placed where people aren't going to be floating these things up the... Yeah, and I think you alluded to it earlier today, too. You talked about you wanted to have a boat, patrol boat, and you said those won't last long. They'll be... The cops said that they'll be gone. So the schools were part of that. They also had community benefits. You also had patrols. You also had these lawsuits going on where you were filing lawsuits against people who were making claims that you were able to contest.
Yeah. So the secret to the Amazon preservation, whoever has the best title. So if you have a title that pays taxes for 30 years, you technically have the right over the guy who just showed up. We funded about 160 lawsuits and about 80 of these police reports. A lot of people like to, Michael didn't do any police reports. I'm like, that's what we do.
Yeah. Yeah, you just jumped because there's two questions that maybe we could ask here. One is, how did you identify the actual threat? How did the methodology work? You were looking at deforestation in surrounding areas. You had to create a reference area where deforestation had happened. It had to be analogous to the area. How did you go through that whole process? How did you establish that these areas were under threat?
Oh, it's phenomenal. The deforestation rate just in the municipality of Portel is something like 2% a year. So we're talking like 30, 40,000 hectares being cut down every year. It's not, when you have, in most parts of the Amazon, it's probably like 0.4% deforestation. In Portel, some years it's 2%. So when you have that, you just have really high threat. And when you throw that into one of these reference regions, which are the reference region based on elevation, inclination, forest cover, and I believe
local drivers.
Yeah, rainfall, but when you throw that into the calculation to create the reference region, you really you see that Portel has really high threat. And because you don't get 30,000 hectares getting cut down almost anywhere in the Amazon in any municipality in 1 year. It doesn't exist. Portel always rates from like deforestation index. It would always rate between 1 and 3 as the worst in the Amazon. And since the Amazon is basically the highest deforestation rate in the world, Portel is basically rated between 1 and 3 in the world for like deforestation risk. So it's not me saying this. This is the numbers. So people. Oh, there goes Michael. Making these blazing statements about how bad Portel is. I don't believe it. And unfortunately, it's not me. I just look at the numbers, and the numbers don't lie.
And then you identified the drivers of deforestation as being these land grabs, like illegal loggers physically moving in, taking ownership of the land, filing claims. So
squatters' rights are really bad in Brazil. So it's supposed to be 5 years, but it's more like 12 days. Talking to the police. If we get somebody showing up like a land grabber, we have 12 days to get him out. But he's going to show up there already with a certificate from some local city councilman saying he's been there for 5 years. So they literally go in there, paperwork ready, in hand. If I show up there with a police officer and be like, this person, Jerry here, he just showed up last week. And Jerry is going to have some document. Oh, but officer, I've been here for 5 years. Look at this declaration from the local city council member. He's vouching that I've had my claim here. That's the big issue with these land claims. It's almost impossible to get them out once they're in. But fortunately, what we were facing was industrial land, like criminal land claims that are mass land grabs with huge number of strawmen. And that's when we have to file all these lawsuits. So it's like there's 4 survey engineers, these survey people who are doing the paperwork out of like 180,000 hectares of land grabbing. So it's really pretty intense.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a bit because that is an important detail. Because that came later, right? Or was that there from the start that it was the one guy? No, that was throughout, wasn't it?
It was August of 2021.
Yeah.
We spotted it. That's the person who faked Jonas Morioka's power of attorney.
We'll pick up on the faked power of attorney in the next installment. But first, a reminder that Bionic Planet is user-supported. If you want more and better episodes, then consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/Bionic Planet. That's patreon.com/Bionic Planet. And Bionic Planet is all one word, no dots or dashes. There you can support the show for as little as $1 per episode, but with a monthly cap. You can also support us by giving us an honest 5-star review on whichever podcatcher you access us through. That helps because the more stars we get, the more ears we get. And the more ears we get, the more minds we can reach. And we must reach hundreds of millions of minds if we're to meet the climate challenge. We can do it if we all work together. Now back to Michael Greene and how he came into possession of the unpopulated land he eventually developed his project on.
Yeah, so we had this contract. It was basically a promissory note, and we cashed it. We went to the court and said, hey, this guy guaranteed me this, and Morioka, I think it was March of 2017, he paid me in land. And I had multiple attorneys look at it, and they said the land's great. That's a great deal. Good for you. And my attorney, Evaldo Pinto, who did the lawsuit, he's the vice president of the Bar Association for the state of Pará at the time, and he had 21% contingency on that. So he's not going to take land if he felt that the title was going to be a problem later, or if he felt that later on some public title was going to show up.
Okay, so now you've got the land, now you've got the project. Now can we talk about the start dates on all these projects? Because that is something that can confuse people as well. Because under the methodologies and to encourage early action, you could have a start date that is earlier even than the methodologies came into effect. They were afraid that people were going to sit around and wait and do nothing. So there was the ability to have start dates. What's the start date on all these projects?
Ron's and Kevin's project is January 1st, 2009. Their contracts were signed 2010 and 2011. So that's what you were just talking about. My contract was different. Mine was 2012, and I did wait around and I officially started doing social work in 2016. And we were the opposite of what they did. They actually had their start date earlier than the project contract was signed. And the Riverina Red was, I don't even know what it was. I was just a consultant. I think it was like 2017 or something.
Okay. And what was the justification for the 2009 start date? What activities had they undertaken at that point?
Morioka had property keepers out there, and I think the justification was that they're not cutting wood, they're preserving.
Mm-hmm. We have to keep in mind, too, that these were, in this first phase, in those early days, it was like, we got to just get stuff up and running, and we can fix the details later. The idea was we would adjust over time, constant improvement.
Oh, yeah, but here's the thing. Right now, it's a template. You have this nice fancy form that they use at Vera.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty sure that Ron's original project document doesn't even use a template. It was just kind of like a report they made.
Yeah, those early PDDs were, there was no comparability, not like now where everything's standard. In fact, now it's all going to be electronic, and it'd be like filling out a tax form. But back then, they were like narratives.
It was like people were just figuring it out.
So now in 2021, you were the project manager for Kevin's project, but as of 2017, you had your own project, which was the Rio Anapu project.
Yeah, 2016 was when that one started. 2021 is when I took over as the project developer for Kevin's. But from day one, by March, I was asking him for the account access because I needed access to their Vera account so I could actually do the paperwork, and he never gave it to me. So he wasn't actually serious, and we never actually did anything. So we actually resigned a few months before the contract expired. We just basically said, listen, we weren't able to really do anything. That's it.
Okay, so your involvement in these three other projects was tangential, because in some of the articles, you're presented as being like the dominant force in this area, like as owning all four projects, and you really were a consultant on some, and then you just had your own.
Well, I wouldn't even go that far. For Kevin's project, Kevin and I don't get along, and we don't talk, and so I had nothing to do with his verification of his second set of credits. I had no involvement in it, and yeah, I'm considered the owner, and this is the weird thing. When I took over as this 18-month consulting contract for them, in 2021, they had put me as the owner of the project. I'm like, what's that all about?
Yeah, what was that? Because you had mentioned, I saw that in your paperwork where you were listed as an owner, and you said you were never an owner. That was dropped in there.
I don't know why he did that. I thought it was a little bit irregular in that he put my name without my permission in a document, and there was no explanation for it. And from a juridical standpoint, my name would never go in any documents. I always use my company name. For legal reasons, we're an entity, we're a business, and there's a fine line between our physical person and our juridical person. It was very unusual that he did that without permission. And I'm not saying it's malicious, but it could be, because it was later used against me in several news articles.
Yeah. Okay, and there's so many rabbit holes we could go down here.
We could go on for this. This could be like a 12-hour podcast if we wanted to.
Yeah. Let's try to limit it to 3. Because going into this, because 21 is a big year. Because carbon prices, what were carbon prices like through most of this, and then until now?
I would say this: we were selling credits in the beginning of 2021 at $1.15, $1.20, and before that. Ron's credits, when he sold his, and I talked to Ron about it, and I've seen contracts, and I've worked with brokers with Ron, and we worked a lot together on helping him get his credit. So there are literally contracts for 22 cents.
Yeah.
So Ron's project, the reason that it basically has failed from a financial standpoint and why they have so much debt is because it got approved about 18 months earlier than it should have. Mm-hmm. If he had gotten it approved a little bit later. But the other thing is, because when you live through what Ron and I and even Kevin lived through from like 2009, 2010, all the way till 2021, you're absolutely, you take any deal you get. So if anybody throws a price at you, you say closed. Because nobody imagined that the oil companies would get in 2021 and speculate the price all the way up to $15. Our big mistake was we always took whatever deal was at hand. It didn't matter what the price was. If they threw the price, we accepted. Yeah. And, huge mistake. Huge mistake on our...
Yeah, but you weren't alone. I was at Ecosystem Marketplace back then, and most projects were underwater. There were a few exceptions. I think Wildlife Works... because they just did such a good job of marketing. That was something they were really good at. And they were getting higher prices. And then you had some that were selling into the World Bank or something at a higher price. And I think you were involved in Code Red with the Rosewood project.
That's Ron's project.
Ah. And that was actually getting higher prices through Code Red.
Yeah, but those were like $1,000 a month. That doesn't pay any... That pays...
Yeah, because it was small volume. It was retail volume. But... again, the point is everybody was struggling at that point. And then suddenly the world awoke to the enormity of the challenge. And at that point, the voluntary market, which was supposed to be this little kind of additional thing that you do to go above and beyond what's required by law, was the only thing there. Everything else had failed. There'd been no climate action at this point. All the promises made in Paris and everything else, nothing had really been done. And suddenly, companies that often couldn't be bothered to think about climate change a few years earlier decided to cover their butts, and money started coming in, and it seemed like a lifeline. The idea, of course, was not that would be the ultimate solution, but this was at least the beginning of their voluntary engagement, and it seemed like a lifeline. But ultimately, it became the kiss of death, because any for-profit conservation effort that succeeded, where old school philanthropy or activism had failed, it basically became a target.
I think it was Biden, though, stirred it on, though. It wasn't like Paris. I think that Biden, when he got elected president, it was Trump for the previous 4 years. 2021, Biden comes in, and everybody was like, oh, Biden's going to make us do stuff. So the oil companies and like the airlines were like, okay, let's go do it. Mm-hmm. And the lowest hanging fruit is red, carbon credits. Mm-hmm. And red, when done right, is pretty amazing. We just bought $2 million worth of carbon credits from this project that's going to go build 20 schools in the Amazon. We're on board with that. And what happened is Unfortunately, you have the KMSs and you have a few other groups that have really dirtied the waters and given ammunition to these journalists who are against red and other blogs and whatnot that don't like it. The Guardian, for example. And they give ammunition to those negative news stories.
Yeah. The Guardian, in my opinion, didn't even go for the bad stuff. They just said bad things about the good stuff.
Yeah, that's the one thing. Oh, in my story, look at me. The Intercept said, supposedly Mr. Greene is building 20 schools. It's you're supposedly, you are or you're not. How can you write supposedly? That just, it's like innuendo. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. Then let's get...
That's the power of the pen. How can you sacrifice the person who's building 20 schools? And by the way, those schools would literally service, 1,000 children? Those 1,000 kids are not going to have schooling now.
Let's talk about the schools. Because this was 2021 when you finally started to get carbon income. It finally started coming in.
Yep.
And this is when you started to ramp up. And you did start to get the higher prices. And I remember, again, I was talking to you at that point. You were excited. And you sold some credits at $4 a ton. It was right before they took off. And you were excited that you had some money coming in. And you were building these schools. You were building a brick factory. You were finally starting to do everything that you were talking about for all these years. And this is also when you brought in the embezzler, as we're going to call him. Yes. Right? This was that same. So what do we talk about this? Because now
$4 was a lucky price.
Yeah.
No, we had actually sold significantly less. But we got approved. It was actually supposed to be approved in December of 2020, but then we got one of these crazy denunciations from a film guy who had never been to my project. He had come out for Ron's project and did a film, and this is like one of these crazy situations. He wrote an 11-page document to Vera claiming all this nonsense about the project, saying that the people in the region weren't aware of it. And this is late. This is 2021, I think. 2020, I think. End of 2020. And by this time, 1,500 families had already gotten the Cadastro Ambiental Rural, the car. For this guy to make accusations like people didn't know about it. And what it was, this is one of these absolutely crazy experiences. He came in 2019, did an interview. He had started talking to some people in the region who were connected to the logging industry while he was doing his film work for Ron's project. And he said, I will work for free for you. I just want to manage your operation. I'm like, oh, one of these guys. And I just imagine that he wanted to work for free so he could do the bidding of the illegal loggers to maintain the status quo. He wouldn't be working for free. He would be working for me for free while being paid by illegal loggers to basically sabotage the operation or to basically look the other way when we were doing monitoring. So the project was originally delayed. It was supposed to be December of 2020. And because of that, we locked in a lot of sales in 2020 before the prices took off. And that was one of these situations where it was very unfortunate. So the project finally got approved in September of 2021, and we went from 12 employees to 100 employees within 6 months.
Two things happened in 2021, really. The money starts coming in. You put out bids for the schools.
Yes.
You put out bids for the brick factory. And at the same time, Jonas, then, you convince him to file this lawsuit against Ronaldo Robson Matos Santana Jr., this technician who was
land grabbing the whole region. He's land grabbing everything.
So you go to him, you point this out, and according to my notes here, his name was on car documents. He had been inserting car documents for an area, 124,194 hectares.
300,000 acres this guy's land grabbing.
Yeah, his name shows up on all this stuff.
We're off to the races. We're also funding the DEMA, the environmental police. And let's just say, we're not bribing them, but we are giving them travel assistance to the region, and we are providing boats for them to go out and raid illegal logging barges as well. Mm-hmm. And that was the straw that kind of broke the camel's back, and we'll get into that later. But
we can talk, because that was something that is 2021, right?
No, that we started doing it in 2021, and we ramped it up into 2022. When we were doing the raids,
well, you were nervous about that. I remember when you mentioned that.
No, what was nervous about it is I was doing it, and then my attorney said, "Don't do that." because you can get in a lot of trouble just talking to police, and doing that, they could turn the tables on you and start like extorting you. And so my attorney basically handled denunciations against illegal loggers with the police, because he didn't want me to be like funding the police, and then the police would say, oh, this American's spending a lot of money just for preservation work. By the way, you're being under investigation for this or that, or you can pay me a bunch of money. And that's what my attorney was afraid of, is that they would see me as a wallet that they could extract value from. So the brick factory started in June 21st of 2021. And we were wanting to build schools almost immediately, even before the project was approved, because we knew it was going to be approved. We already had locked in a lot of buyers from December of 2020. And so we knew we would get money in. And we had met with a lot of buyers. We spoke to them and said our plan, our vision, our goal, and they loved it. The buyers were totally on board of the idea of 20 schools, 20 first aid clinics, 1,500 water wells. And it was awesome. But it was always difficult operating. And it's because this is an impoverished region, so you're hiring impoverished people. The good help in Sao Paulo would be extremely expensive, and they don't even want to live in Portel. We brought in ultra-educated help in 2020 from Belém, like really nice guys. They were great. They never embezzled. There was one guy named Adriano. He was sweet, engineering degree in agriculture sciences, and he did an amazing job. But he's like, I'm going to get married. I don't want to have this life. Michael, I really like you. You do a great project, but it's not for me. So we had a lot of cases like that. So we had one guy who was managing the brick factory. Brick inventory should have been 270,000 by October of 2021, just piling up, ready to go into schools. And our brick inventory, I was asking another guy to give numbers, and another employee, I'm like, hey, I need you to go there. I need you to get the inventory number. And he'd always brush me off. So we know that both the brick manager and this other guy were part of stealing the bricks. So I had Alberto, who is our biomass technician, go out there. And Alberto has been with me. He's one of my oldest employees. Very trustworthy. In doing biomass points, measuring trees in the forest, you really need to have a trustworthy person, because doing those wrong or getting somebody who's lazy, it messes up all the calculations and you have to do it again. So Alberto went there and he goes, Michael, you have 129,000 bricks in inventory. And I'm like, that's not right. So I said, okay, go there next week too and measure. And next week it was 123,000 bricks in inventory. So I'm like, wow, they're stealing more bricks than they can produce. And then we hired another guy in October of 2021. And we hired 2 construction foremen. And they were building a new office for us in Portel next to the factory. We had all these receipts from this new guy. And he and his accountant and the accountant's niece, who was the attorney, had fabricated 5 fake construction companies. So they would create a company, pull off internet pictures off the internet, and say, oh, Michael, we have done the due diligence on this marvelous construction company. They're going to be the ones who can build the schools for you. Here's the contract. And there were 5 companies that were fabricated by the manager.
Yeah.
I mean,
and this, we should point out though that, because I think if you, the way you're saying it, it sounds like you kept having bad luck over and over again when they were actually referred through the same sources. So that's important.
What I think was happening is there was one guy who came in May of 2021 who, we would hire people and he would get to them and say, here's the deal. Michael's the wallet. You're going to try to take advantage of him as best as possible, and I'm going to help you. And so the guy from October to December 10th, we fired him. He was there to get the schools going, and I had my attorney look at these companies, these 5 construction companies, and he was like, no, these are fake. And so then I went to a different project in a different region of Brazil, and I went to the landowner there. And I said, do you have anybody you know that can come and manage my operation in Portel from a security standpoint? And if he's good or she's good, we will then put him over the entire operation. So then that's when the embezzler came. And the embezzler was amazing. I met with him in, I think, February 2nd of 2022 in Sao Paulo with Jonas Morioka. and Zach Morioka and myself, and then the embezzler's right-hand man, which is another guy who I learn now is incredibly dangerous. He kind of looked like this skinny young guy, and I turned out he's from more dangerous than the embezzler because he actually goes through with it. So I hired this guy. The first 3 months he's doing these patrolling, and when we do the patrolling, we like to do pictures of everybody's house. And he did a really nice Google Earth type picture file embedded into the Google Earth, so you could click on the picture, a little link, and then it would show the picture and the location of where the house is. And I was like, wow, I've been trying to get that out of my own team for like the last few years, and that's better than anything they've done. So we really like you. And this guy was the smoothest talker ever. He was like the perfect confidence scheme. Michael, you're like family to me. You're my brother. You're my brother. We're going to be brothers for the rest of our lives together. And so in May of 2022, I put him in charge of our finances to pay bills. And in November of 2023, we found out that he stole like 8.5 million reais.
What's that in dollars? What's that in dollars?
About 1.7 million. And then there's still another $800,000 that's up in the air. And he was doing everything with it. He was bribing governmental officials to go after me. Every news journal that's gone down there, he would bring them out to the land. So like when the Washington Post went down, his team brought them out to the land. He's very malicious. And I can get into it.
I'm going to interrupt just for a second because I think listeners are going to be going, okay, why are you letting this guy ramble on about an unnamed person doing all this vague stuff? Under normal circumstances, I'd be challenging you on every step. And the reason is, you and I have talked about this for a long time, A. B, you did send me a very long dossier where you provide a lot of the evidence. And C, there is another report, because I have not been able to visit the area. This is something, too, that's been one of my great frustrations as we've been talking for a long time. And I've just not had the budget to go down there and visit and report myself. But there is another reporter, a guy named John Meyer, who visited the area independently. I've spoken to him. I don't want to take away his scoop, but he has spoken to so many people on the ground and corroborated so much of what you're saying. So there is a lot going on here. There's a lot of nuance. I think we'll just tell people that there's more to come. Why don't we just do that on a lot of these details? And I don't want to mention his name because then I've got to go and call him up and do all this other reporting, and I just don't have the time for it. But what's clear is that you trusted somebody who came in. You paid him for patrols that weren't conducted. You found out later, right?
Yeah. We found out that he patrolled up until May of 2022. And we can get into what happened in May if you want. May 2022, we did a logging raid, and it confiscated over $6 million worth of equipment.
You did that, or
the police did it. So my attorney made the denunciation, and he's on the report. The report was published on June 8th, and I put that in that dossier that we sent you. Mm-hmm. And we think what happened was, this is a hypothesis, we think that the illegal loggers went to the embezzler and said, you work for us now. You're no longer working for Mr. Greene. And we don't know if that was the catalyst of his embezzlement, because we have proven out now that he was embezzling, he wasn't in charge of money, but he was embezzling material goods prior than that. So he stole the food for 900 families. He's a real winner. And that was in February of 2022, right when he started. The first thing he did, the first day on the job, he stole the food of the poor. There was these news stories claiming that we're land grabbers in October of 2023, and he was talking to my wife, and he said to my wife, Bolsonaro's one of his assistants, just got indicted. And for those who don't know who Bolsonaro was, he was the right-wing president in Brazil, and then there was all these investigations. So this assistant of Bolsonaro was indicted. She was a young female, and she was only indicted, and she jumped out of the window and committed suicide. And so the embezzler, when we were in the news, he said to my wife, because she did a lot of translating for me, I wasn't a part of this phone call, she said, there's a better way to go if it comes down to it. And so my wife, that stuck with her, and 2 months later, she's like, that the guy was the worst person in the world. He tried to have me commit suicide. And it just shows the level of character he is. And later on, we spoke to numerous actual employees, because he was never an employee, he was just a third-party contractor. And each one of them told us that they were scared to hell of him and his team, because two of the guys on his team are like huge, intimidating guys who are part of these right-wing militias. And if anybody follows Brazil, these right-wing paramilitary militias are like basically they're police officers who act illegally. And so I'm pretty sure these guys are former police officers because they're working for him, but they're scary guys. And so my whole team was terrified when he was there, and nobody ever told me until he was gone because they were afraid.
Well, they also said there was something in there early on. He had told them that they no longer worked for you. They worked for him. Yeah.
So they got 30 or 40 employees together the first meeting and basically said, don't ever bother Michael again. You work for me now. I'm the owner of the projects. I own these carbon projects here in Portel, and I'm going to be the one who manages them, and you don't need to talk to Michael at all. The end goal of what he was trying to do, he was trying to become the owner of and basically steal these carbon credit projects. The same way a land grabber would steal land, they thought that it was feasible, and this is why RED is actually pretty good about this. You can't steal a RED project. It doesn't exist. It's impossible. You can destroy a RED project, but you can't steal a RED project. And if you destroy one, don't believe that it's ever going to come back, because it's not. A destroyed RED project it's just failed. It's not going to, nobody's ever doing anything there again.
Well, I hope you're wrong, and I think you are too. In a lot of the early RED projects, the modeling was such that the project area was far away from the current deforestation, and that's where a lot of legitimate criticism comes in. But under VM48, the new consolidated RED methodology, the distance to recent past deforestation matters. So if things really are going badly now that these projects have been put on ice, and all the evidence I've seen says they are, if the patient then is really sick and not just, susceptible to sickness, then there could be a chance of getting medicine, funding, if it's not too late. So
yeah, I think that more so with it's really hard to resurrect a project that failed. Let's just put it that way.
So it was in June of 2022 that the person we're calling the embezzler is the one who told you that basically a public title had been placed on top of the private titles.
Yeah. It was basically a concession. They gave an association a concession for this massive territory. It was started in December of 2021, the process. It was funded by a logging group called AMC Flower. And where we were able to, when we got accused of all this stuff, we'll investigate it. We'll read every document. We've probably read 10,000 documents. And we had to dig into public defender records to figure out what the heck is going on, how did it happen, and who's behind it. Everybody in the news is saying, "Oh, Michael developed a project on public land." No, I never. Absolutely never. It was a public land created by a logging company. And then when the public land got completed, the Association of Traditional People who had the concession made a denunciation against the logging company because they were going to get something like 80% of the wood rights or something like that. So it was just shocking.
We're going to loop back to that, but I just want to make sure we pin down this sequence right. In June of 2022, that's when you learned that there'd been a concession placed on top of the land. That was when you learned of it. And then what was your response at that point?
Well, we froze. We didn't do anything. We were actually going to go into the second verification for the project, and we just stopped because it didn't feel right. It's not easy to get a verification done, and having a conflict rate this is definitely going to come up in a public comment period. Mm-hmm. And there's no way to hide it. You would have to disclose it. And it wasn't really prudent to move forward. We did keep on doing the social work. We did keep on building the schools. We had signed contracts for the schools, and that was that.
And I do remember, by the way, when this happened because you told me about it. You were incensed. You were like, what is this? I don't understand this. It can't be.
I didn't understand. And I wrote 5 different explanations of what's going on, and everyone's different than the reality.
Well, that's what
I couldn't figure out, what the heck is going on? How does this happen? How do you just come up with a giant public title? And how does that happen? Because public titles occur, but it takes years to get them through, like public hearings, public process, public this, public that, review processes. Brazil is a bureaucratic country. You don't just show up with a public title out of the middle of nowhere.
No, this is because, and I remember thinking, this guy's lost his mind, because you were,
I did lose my mind. I couldn't figure out, nobody could explain to me how you show up with a public title. And you were probably on most of those emails. I had no idea what, and Vera must have been like, yeah, Michael lost his mind.
Yeah.
Too much.
I was on some.
PTSD.
Yeah.
He's got PTSD down there, and he's gone crazy.
Yeah, I was on some. I was just a little of context to people too, because I had met you as a journalist, and that's where we were in contact. And it's funny how you say you were the biggest free source of information in the Amazon, and that was one reason I talked to you a lot. Was you freely talked about what you perceive things to be, and I think your facts have always stood up. Your theories sometimes didn't, but I think that's just the creative mind at work. But you always had your facts right, and I was always able to. And there were so many things that you predicted were going to happen that happened. So I came to see you as a good source, and you were always anonymous too. And usually when I do a story, I talk to 5 different people and try to triangulate, and your stuff tended to hold up. And in this particular case, though, I was at Vera, but I was in a different capacity. I was just trying to help out. I was trying to develop educational material for them and doing a little bit of media relations. And you were calling me up, and I was like directing you to people, but you were, and I felt. And I was like, this guy, he's losing it. He's all over the place.
I had no idea what was going on.
No idea. And every day, I got it now. Hey, I got it. I figured it out.
But now we actually have it. We actually have it, and I can tell you what actually happened.
Well, let's go through the next sequence, though, too, because this was then in November of 2022. This was in the middle of the climate talks. This World Rainforest Movement comes out with this report. Neocolonialism, blah, blah. I forget what it was called. And I remember seeing, like, somewhere in there, Intercept had done something that was pretty lame, I thought.
Here's what happened. Neocolonialism was brought down by, there's a guy named Carlos Ramos, who is a local, very big anti-red local in Portel, very far ideologue. And he, along with an opposition candidate to the mayor, brought down the World Rainforest Movement with $60,000 of funding from an anonymous source, which I don't know, but I do know that it was $60,000. And they brought in World Rainforest Movement because it was a lot of political, because the mayor was getting famous because of all these schools that we were building. And Mayor Paulo Ferreira was the unplanned beneficiary of massive school construction in the municipality, where that's unheard of in Brazil. No municipality builds 20 schools in a year or two. Now, I do have fault. I should have done far more to make sure my organization was non-political and voiced that, because I think that when we've spoken to the opposition candidate of the mayor, and he apologized for his involvement in it, and he wasn't aware that we were a non-political organization. But that goes back to the embezzler. The embezzler was making us a political organization when our direct directive was stay neutral, it'll come back and bite you. Don't get involved with politics, it'll come back and bite you. And we repeated that over and over again. But he loved the power. The embezzler was a maniac, and he absolutely loved the power of having so much power. And he even said to us in probably November of 2022, I am the kingmaker in Portel. I decide who gets elected and who does not. And I said to him, do not get involved in politics. It will come back and bite you. And it never came back to bite him. It came back to bite me, because people thought that I was giving directive to him to get involved with politics. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this guy. This is way off track. This is my only tangent, I promise you. But, let me tell you about World Rainforest Movement. It was a soft launch in July of 2022, right after the public title went down. It failed. Nobody read it. It didn't go anywhere. It was uninteresting. And so then the funders of this, the $60,000, did another launch in November. And it wasn't because of the climate talks. It was because the mayor was giving us a license to continue the project. So they wanted to do a hard relaunch to prevent the city council of Portel and the mayor to give me a license to operate in the region, despite the public title, because they didn't want me to stop building those schools. They needed those schools because that was helping them make them very popular politicians. And they absolutely needed me to go. So they did the relaunch in November, and they couldn't get it done in time because I was trying to delay the Intercept reporter as long as possible. And they actually came in 2 days after the license was issued for us to operate. So if they had done that relaunch probably 2 days before the license, they would have never given it to me.
Yeah. Gotcha. Okay, interesting. Because for me, I don't remember seeing the first one. I remember seeing this one and reading and just looking at it and saying this thing is... I'm not going to go into the details now because I want to do a separate episode on under the tribes of the climate realm, a vertical going into the World Rainforest Movement and some of these anti-red groups and some of the ones some that have credibility and probably may some be a little bit constructive and some that are just plain clown shows, for lack of a better word. And this one was pretty bad. It was something that anybody who knew how things worked would have dismissed immediately as a joke. And that was, I think, what you chose to do. And I was in a weird position, too, because I was hearing from you. At Vera, we don't really talk to the project developers in an official capacity on media stuff. You have to handle your own media stuff. It was all an effort not to do that. And so you were calling me, and I was going to Vera saying, hey, this thing came out that's a joke. But if people don't understand what a joke it is, it could have legs. And I wanted to counter it. And the attitude from everybody at that time was, yeah, it's so bad, no one's going to pay attention to it. It'll go away. But among the many claims in there, the one that seemed to have teeth, because it was like reading the opposite of the PDDs. It portrayed you as the land grabber, and so it did portray you as doing the opposite of what you were doing. It portrayed you as everything you said at the very start of the show was portrayed in that piece, along with a lot of other stuff. But the thing that had teeth was this issue of titles and claiming that you didn't have the titles, and that those claims. Maybe you could elaborate. Like those claims were then picked up by the local defender's office. That's really where a lot of the stuff seemed to happen to me. But this is right.
They're all very opaque in this, and we don't know all the individuals involved. In this, we have a very good idea of all the antagonists of this attack, but the project has titles.
Mm-hmm.
Morioka bought them in 92, and he had an investigation done in 1992, 2 years after he bought, and they did an investigation to make sure the titles were fine, and they were. And that was done by the judiciary for the state of Pará. So that was one check. Yes, everything's fine. Then they actually did another investigation in 2000. That was another check. That's fine. And then in 2001, which we're finding, what I would say is questionable and irregular actions by governmental employees. They started changing data within the government for his land, which we find out. And I'm not using the word corruption, but I am going to use the word irregular.
Yeah.
And facts figures, sizes of land started changing in 2001, where the land would be 4,356
And you found this,
hectares.
but you found this after the fact, right?
Yeah, I found this in our investigation.
So basically, now my understanding of the sequence of events was that first of all, this report came out. And what I found weird was it really was going after you. It didn't mention anybody else. Made it, and that was pretty clear. And then when the public defender, when did she come out? When was hers?
Well, here's what happened. When they created the public title with this group AMC Flower as the funder.
Yeah, but wait, let's get to that.
But here's the thing.
But that's a revelation that comes after her action, right?
No,
so
this is how she came after me.
Yeah, but you don't know. But
we do know now.
But no, what I'm saying is listeners don't know about what she did. We need to talk about the action first.
All right.
So she came after you. So when did you first hear about her accusation?
Oh, yeah, I think it was February 2nd, 2023.
And she was basically picking up, my perception at the time was that she had picked up on the World Rainforest Movement and then turned that was like her trigger to come after you. And then she also shut down all the asked all the projects be shut down. She sent a letter to Vera saying, shut all this stuff down. That was her.
So that was the public story of what was going on. But the backstory is far different than that, because there was a big history of what was going on before that.
And this is in your dossier. I have that.
No,
here,
this is not even in that. This is more
this is
recent.
new.
Yeah, this
Okay.
is newer. We dug deeper into my dossier into the August 5th, 2022 complaint against the logging group that helped create the public title.
What's it, this flower?
Yeah,
flower.
it's called AMC Flower.
Okay.
And it turns out that the public defender was going after them first. And the public defender's office had received a complaint against AMC Flower for violating the rights of traditional people. And they actually had a contract in there. They were making a complaint about this contract where AMC Flower was going to get 70% of all the logging rights over the territory of this new public land, and the traditional community would get 30%, yet the operating expenses were taken off the top. So really the traditional people would actually get 18%. And this was a logging and carbon contract. It wasn't just logging.
Now, they were involved earlier, but you found out about them later. Can you talk about how you found out about them?
The local community that gained the concession for this public area was Association Joanna Pires and then Association Dorothy Stang. And we talked to them today, so I know these guys. I can talk to them anytime I want. And they got their concession, and they realized that the company that helped create the public title, this AMC, had ripped them off. So AMC Flower would gain 70% of the carbon rights and 70% of the logging rights over this concession that has thousands of people on it. And it's something like 240,000 hectares. So on that concession, it's literally probably $50 or $60 million worth of wood a year. And on August 5th of 2022, Ronaldo Marinho, the president of the association that holds the concession to the public title, made a complaint against AMC Flower at the public defender's office. And that was the original investigation before they went after me. And then in November, when the World Rainforest Movement and the Intercept did the story, and just so you know, that fell flat too. Nobody actually read. I think 800 people read the Intercept story. It wasn't anything major. And nobody took the World Rainforest Movement story really, truly seriously. That's when the public defender took notice and took her eyes off the actual logging group and put it onto the preservationists, which I find very ironic. And in February, early February, she was sending me emails and sending Vera emails saying that Michael Greene is a land grabber violating the rights of traditional people.
So now you say the public title showed up in 2022, but the Washington Post says the land was set aside for river people in 2012.
I can go into that. So all of these programs, the Cadastro Ambiental Rural, the program of Teja Legal, which allows land grabbing, all of these programs have a start date. But it takes an individual to execute on the land grab or the I'm getting my title, as they say. So it required the community to do it. So we actually, the mayor Paulo Ferrer is actually against these collective titles. He thinks it's bad for the region. He actually wants the traditional families to have individual. So it's more of like ideology. So it wasn't ever sure. And in October of 2021, it had not even started yet. The process to complete the one has not started. Now, the program, if we want to go into like areas supposedly set aside, as in the Washington Post story, there's huge swaths of land that would potentially qualify for a public title. And actually, I was actually reading it today. Page 9 of the decree that creates the program that allows for the creation of public titles actually says that private property has to be excluded. So Jonas Morioka's titled property should have been excluded from the public area. And that's when, it started December of 2021. It was completed June 30th of 2022. It took 7 months to complete it, when other public titles take 7 years. And so they rushed through it, and they skipped all the bureaucratic processes and checks. And Morioka's land, under a proper procedure, they would have actually they're supposed to go to the registry office, check to see if there's private property title there, and exclude it from the public deed. And they did not do that. They did not follow their procedures. They took shortcuts on purpose because their goal was to collect as much land as possible. So AMC Flour had a huge carbon credit project and a huge logging concession, basically.
And as you can tell, I started running out of gas around then. I couldn't remember what we talked about, what we hadn't, but we did regroup a few days later, and I'll have that episode for you in a week or two. Until then, I'm Steve Zwick, right now in Chicago, coming to you next time from Nairobi, Kenya. Thanks for listening.